Hey, y'all, and welcome to SLP Full Disclosure. I'm your host, Michelle, and today we are joined by a very special guest from AMN, and we're going to be talking about all things teletherapy related. Teletherapy is something that's new to me, but it has been very exciting as I transitioned later in my career. And I'm hoping that you guys can take some information from here, start doing your research, and maybe join us over at AMN and become a teletherapist yourself. So we're so excited to have Kristin with us today. I want to give you a little bit of information on Miss Martinez. Kristin has over 20 years of experience in school-based speech-language pathology and brings her past decade of expertise in clinical teletherapy implementation, best practices, and thought leadership to AMN as Senior Director of Teletherapy. Joining AMN in 2023, Kristin is dedicated to leveraging her deep knowledge of school-based services and her passion for ensuring access and equity for all children to lead AMN's team in partnering with schools nationwide to develop impactful and sustainable teletherapy programs. So, Kristin, we're so excited to have you here today. I think my first question is going to be, what is teletherapy in your words? How do you describe teletherapy to people who are not familiar with this service delivery model?
Teletherapy is, of course, it can be across other settings, medical settings. It's certainly used. In our world, we are working directly with students in school-based settings, but teletherapy is essentially reaching people remotely. So whether it's what we are talking about in terms of our services, we are talking about synchronous live therapy sessions, evaluation sessions. There are versions of teletherapy that are asynchronous, such as sending a video instruction, sending homework. But today, what we're talking about in terms of what we provide is that synchronous, live audio and video, connecting, in our case, with kids so that they can receive the school-based services that they are those essential services that are required for them to access education.
Yeah. And that's exactly what it is. It's working with kids on the computer, face to face, and providing those services via teletherapy. And so many times, the number one question that I get is it synchronous or is it something that you've recorded? So I'm so glad that you brought that up. What do you think is the most beneficial part of teletherapy services?
I think the most beneficial part is just ensuring that kids are receiving high quality services, period, regardless of where they live. We are probably going to the third decade now of chronic shortages of SLPs, school psychologists, occupational therapists in school-based settings. And, that has not really gotten any better. If anything, there's a bigger and growing gap between the needs of students and the number of people who are qualified to provide the support that they need. And so teletherapy allows us basically to manage the pool of qualified clinicians and so that kids can access those services. So, it really is for me about access and equity of services. If it's regardless of whether a student lives in a suburban area, a metropolitan area, or off in a very rural area that's 300 miles from the closest urban setting, they still have the same supports. They are still covered under IDEA. So if they
Right.
qualify for services, they have a right to those services, and parents have the right for their kids to get those services. But of course, schools are in a bind when they don't physically have the therapists living in all of these areas to meet those needs, to actually meet the requirements of these IEPs that have been developed. And we want to make sure that kids are getting the services based on what has been deemed appropriate for them, what has been, through testing, through evaluation, through observation, what professionals and educators see as the supports they need in order to access general education services. That's what these services are intended to do, is to support those kids. And the type and the level of support and services they receive shouldn't be dependent on where they live. It should be, dependent on whether they have qualified for those services or not. And then the teletherapy is a way for schools to bring qualified therapists to the students regardless of location.
Right. And I think one misconception that everyone has is that teletherapy is something that just came about and
Mm-hmm.
just started after the COVID pandemic. And
Right.
that's not true, is it? How long has this service delivery model been around and been available to school districts and to therapists to utilize?
It has been, really teletherapy on the medical side was, I think began even in Australia before it ever started in the United States. It
Oh,
was
wow.
born out of that need because they have such large rural areas of trying to get healthcare to people who lived far away from metropolitan areas. But in our country, as far as what we're talking about, again, school-based teletherapy services, we are going on about 13, 14 years at least of
Wow.
this being a really established service. That has been an interesting experience for me because I personally started in teletherapy in 2013, so 11 years ago.
Okay.
After having been physically in schools for the first 13 years of my career, and so we have worked so hard. I worked with schools and with parents to help build trust and build understanding, just really educate about teletherapy and clinicians. And then, of course, when the pandemic hit and everybody became a teletherapist because out of just necessity, there was no other way to
Right.
reach kids. Um, and,
Yeah, we had no
we know
choice.
there was a really wide range of how that went for people, whether we're talking about therapy or just online education, school. And so since that time, there has been a bit of we've kind of taken a step back in terms of acceptance because, quality, these teletherapy programs that have been established for a long time really got kind of pulled into some of the frustration around so many things happening during that time and online learning. So, we're building back up, we're doing some re-education and helping educators, helping clinicians, helping parents understand that there is a difference between kind of those emergency, like we just have to jump on and figure something out versus people who have been doing this for a decade or more and have learned, the research around best practices, what people have shared with each other. And, I've seen so many tremendous therapists work in teletherapy and to just do incredible things with students. So it's just, it's a different service delivery. It's a different way of delivering services. It's not a different therapy. So, those of us, we as SLPs, Michelle, it is. We're just transitioning our skills.
Right. And I think that's a really good point that it's not a it's just a different way of providing those services to those students. And like you said, during the COVID pandemic, we were all just thrown into it and with little to no training. Like myself, I was a virtual therapist, teletherapist, like one day later with no training, and it was very daunting. Am I going to be tech savvy enough to do this? How do I present, different things to the kids? Where are we going to play games? Are we just going to talk? Like, what are we going to do? And I have found personally that um, the kids nowadays are so into computers, they're so into video games, they're so into all of those things that I feel like I can get more engagement from them when we are on the computer. And I have seen so much growth and so much progress in my school aged kids. And I have elementary kids. And I even worked in early intervention, that birth to three population, which again, it was a highly effective therapy model, connecting with those families. So, I mean, I think that for me, it was a wonderful experience, but a lot of teletherapists, a lot of speech language pathologists who were thrown into teletherapy during the pandemic, they had bad experiences, and they didn't we and it wasn't something teletherapy wasn't something that I even knew existed until the COVID pandemic. And so finding out that it's been around for more than a decade is just incredible. And knowing that there are people out there that have been doing this for a long time and that it is effective and it is a great way to provide services to students, like you said, who live in areas that don't have access to therapists. So, um, and primarily, we're talking about school aged and the school population, but are there other facilities that are accessing teletherapy as a therapeutic model, or is it mainly school based that we're seeing? Or are we seeing
I
trends
mean,
in other areas as well?
absolutely, there are things happening in the medical setting. Um, I was, the company that I used to work for, there was a point when they were looking to launch a study, a swallowing study, working with teletherapists, SLPs remotely, connecting with, working with a nurse, a doctor with the patient, and doing, these remote swallowing studies. So, I mean, there's really fascinating things that can happen. And of course, in our world as SLPs, OTs, absolutely private clinics, I think, are offering, but again, both options. In some cases, having kids join from home so that, they're not having to, parents aren't having to throw them in the car after school and drive them to the clinic. They can have their speech therapy session, their private session from home. So I think that,
Right.
yes, absolutely, there are a lot of things happening. I've seen, there's some companies doing some very cool things around VI in relation to working with students. Specifically, there's a company that I have, connected with in the past that has developed VI technology to remotely work with autistic students. So
Wow.
I think that it's really just opened up a world of creativity and just invention around how can we again create better access for kids and adults.
Right. Um, what I know that we've talked about teletherapy, what it is, who's utilizing it, how
Mm-hmm.
we're delivering these services. We know it's an effective therapy model, effective way to deliver services. Um, what does a person have to have personally to be able to become a teletherapist? Do you have to have a background? Do you need that training? Do you need specific training? What would you say to a speech pathologist out there who might be listening to the podcast who is like, maybe that's something I might be interested in?
Mm-hmm.
Do you recommend having any specific training?
So, for me, what I have seen is the most important training is just experience in your job as a speech language pathologist. Um, I really encourage, and we at AMN, we do require at least 1 year of on-site experience as a school-based SLP before being eligible for a teletherapy position.
Mm-hmm.
That's very intentional, and ideally it would be even a couple years, a few years, because we know as school-based therapists that we have such a broad scope of, our role encompasses so many different areas of working with all kinds of kids, all kinds of disabilities, all kinds of levels of, just whether it's very mild to moderate to severe. It's just a very broad scope, and it takes time to get experience,
Yes.
but I think that the most important thing, I think, is having physically been part of a school, understand how schools work, how IEP teams work, that you are part of
Mm-hmm.
a team, because it can be really challenging to be a remote in any position and not
Mm-hmm.
really have that perspective of who you're working with. Like, what am I stepping into? What am I joining? So, I think that's the most important thing is at least a year, if not more, of having kind of done the full scope of evaluations, developing IEPs, running IEP meetings, completing or being a case manager for some of those speech only kiddos. That at least, as SLPs, you have that perspective, you have that reference point, so that when you do join a team as a remote SLP, that you have that picture and kind of what you're joining, what you're stepping into. And then as far as teletherapy training, I think that there are absolutely tips and tricks, things that just, over time, those of us who have been doing it for a long time, little things that you just pick up. Like, if I'm running an IEP meeting, I make sure that I have the list of everybody who has been in, the names of everybody enrolled, everyone who's been invited to that IEP meeting. So in case the audio is not great and they set it up so that everybody's around a big table and I can't hear necessarily, I am not relying on that to see who's there in the meeting. It's easier to have the name. I'm like, oh, okay, this person, check. This person's here, this person's here. So, which those are just things you pick up with experience. That's not about being an SLP. That's just about, really working remotely, like some of those things that help. But, like I said, teletherapy is not a different form of therapy. It is, if you have the skills to work with those kids in person, then you figure out how to transition that into a remote setting. If anything, I really think it sharpens our skills. I feel like I say that it's an extra tool in our toolkit. SLPs, we build that toolkit, and that's what we do throughout our careers, is just add more tools. It's just another one. And I think that I became a better therapist when I moved to teletherapy, because
I 100% agree.
Yeah, I did have to think differently about how I approached working with certain students or certain goal areas. But I think you realize that, maybe what I thought was required was not actually required. That was just sort of a crutch I was using, because they're in person, and now I just have to get a little creative. And, it has, like you said, the kids are so responsive.
They are. They love the computer.
It's their world. I mean, I remember picking up my daughter, like in middle school, and the second she got in the car from having just been with her friends, she'd be back on FaceTime talking with her friends. And there was no difference between that communication. They were still connecting. They were still laughing. They were still being themselves. And so I think that was my biggest worry when I first started teletherapy, that I wouldn't have the same connection with the kids. And that very quickly went away. I just realized, we can still build that rapport. And yeah, they like the technology. They like going to work on the computer, because all the kids in the school are going to work on the computers at some point in their day.
They're taking tests on the computers, their state testing, their regular tests, everything they do is on the computer now. So, and I have found that a lot of my kids can tell me how to do things. They can fix things on the computer. If the camera is not working on the school end and the para is having a hard time, she's like, I'm not really sure. And I'm like, well, let the kids do it. And sure enough,
they're very savvy.
They click around, and then next thing you know, we can hear and we can see everything. So they love it.
Yep.
I know that AMN specifically provides an amazing platform, and I know we've got a new platform launching. Let's talk a little bit about our new platform, Televate. I was actually part of a focus group that got to do some playing around on it and all of the things that it offers. Tell me about Televate. What is that?
Right. So, I joined AMN just last August, so I'm coming up on almost a year with the company, which has been amazing. But I, prior to that, had worked in teletherapy for, 10 years before that. So I really came in with the belief that a very intentionally built therapy platform is an essential piece of that quality therapy. Now, does that make the therapist a better therapist? No, the therapist is a great therapist. They are they are a great SLP. They have that experience regardless of what
Right.
platform. But does it make it easier for that therapist to do their job? Absolutely. And it also has the features, when we're doing teletherapy, we are trying to create a teletherapy session that is as close as possible to when we're sitting in the same room as our students, right?
Right.
We want to make that as close as possible, and that does require clinical tools. And so it's really important to have a platform that is built with a clinical therapy environment, not just a business, not a meeting with, just like a business meeting. It's about kids. It's about, okay, what are the tools that we need to ensure that we are able to do our job, do what we know how to do, that kids are engaged. So Televate we are very excited to be launching for this upcoming school year. And so it includes both case management functionality. As a teletherapist, it's so nice to, as much as possible, have kind of that one-stop shop, like have as many things as possible within
Every
one,
everything
because
in one place, so you're not
everything in one
clicking around
place
all over the place.
as much
Yeah.
as possible. So
Mhm.
there's the ability to upload student referrals, add IEP goals, track data, get graphs from progress that you can share with parents and teachers at IEP meetings. Create your schedule, reoccurring meetings, track absences, so that you have an idea of, the kids that student who has, they've missed 3 in a row. And so there's the case management side, but then of course, most importantly, there is the therapy room. It is having a therapy room where you have tools, features like making sure that, kids there needs to be integrated access. They need to be able to connect and have interaction with the activities on the screen. We don't want them just coming to a session and just watching you and just looking at something. They need to
Right.
be able to interact with that activity and be engaged in that. And, a lot of business platforms don't have that, or there's a lot of workarounds to try to get there. Um, Again, another feature that was really important to me was the ability to integrate a second camera, a document camera. That is essential for psychoeducational evaluations because of the way that those assessments have to be delivered, but
Right.
also for OT services, being able for that OT to be able to see what the student is doing in real time with their fine motor movements, but also not losing the student's face. If we're there in the room with our student, we can see their face, we see their reactions, and also what they're doing with their hands, right? We can see all
Right.
of that. And if you don't have that second camera integration, then you're having to do something weird with the main camera up and down to like look at that. And
Right.
for SLPs, it can be a really incredible tool to have that when you're working with students with AAC devices. If you
Right.
have that second camera to integrate, the student does, then you have that second video feed. If I have Cough Drop app on my iPad, I can have that second camera trained over my iPad. The student has theirs up. And so I'm seeing the student's face. I'm not losing that in order to see what's happening on their device and what the interface looks like and how they're interacting with that. So there's these little things that, to a non-clinician may just
Right.
seem like, well, what's the big deal? As long as you have audio and video, it is a big deal. It's a big deal as clinicians, to be able to, and have all these things, and also not have to, to be able to have features without having to use 3 other systems, right? Like having to do kind of weird
Right.
things with like this screen share, and I'm going to put this extra camera over here.
Right.
SLPs are some of the most creative, and like they will get it done. They will figure it
Yeah.
out, but it doesn't have to be so hard. So,
Right.
so really excited to launch that this school year. And yeah, just I feel like we need to have a high quality platform for teletherapy, and that's really what it's been built around, is specifically working with kids, engaging in teletherapy services.
That's awesome. And I know you're a speech pathologist. I'm a speech
Mm-hmm.
pathologist, and generally, speechies are very organized.
Mm-hmm.
They they like to get things done. They don't like things to be late. They like
Right.
everything to be right
Mm-hmm.
just so. So I think that the aspect of the platform that I was most engaged with was the case management aspect.
I was trying to explain, share that we have this amazing product development team that, they're not clinical, but they're working so hard to respond to, what I said was important. And, I was like, you have to understand that we have, as SLPs, we might have 50, 70,
Mm-hmm.
heaven forbid, 100 kids that we are tracking due dates for. Like
Right.
everything is around these due dates, when they have to have annual reviews, when their evaluations are due, all of these things. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, we have a lot to keep organized. So having that on a dashboard of what's coming up is just, it's a helpful reminder. It helps us, can help us stay on top of things.
Yeah.
Again, in a way that is built in and not having to access so many different systems.
Yeah. And that's been the tricky part for me, is accessing so many different
Mm-hmm.
things, because you've got this website open, and then I work
Right.
a lot with bilingual families, and I think that has been very difficult in trying to bring those interpreters into those meetings. So
Mm-hmm.
I think
Yeah.
having those second cameras, I mean, that is phenomenal. I'm super excited about that, and especially for
Yeah.
my AAC users, because the para tries to hold the device up, and then there's a
Right.
reflection and I can't see it, and
Mm-hmm.
then it's a whole thing. So
Right.
it takes
Yeah.
away from that therapy session, and
Right.
having that ability to see that device, what's on
Mm-hmm.
the device, how are
Right.
they navigating those pages? Am
Mm-hmm.
I seeing something motor planning wise that might help us, or that might be
Right.
hindering us? So I think that's going
Mm-hmm.
to be, I'm super excited about
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
having, another piece that's really important is the integrated assessments, having those visual stimuli. It's integrated. Again, you're not going to a separate system. And one thing I, again, was very, insistent on, because it goes to the validity of our testing, is the ability to see a student's nonverbal response.
Right.
Because of course that's always the conundrum, right? If, for
Right.
you and I right here in this, if I am touching the computer screen right now, because as a student, like I see my, the visual stimuli are exactly what we have, the flip books that we would do if we're in person,
Mm-hmm.
but it's up on the screen. Well, the child just touching the computer screen to indicate their nonverbal response, we can't see that. And I know that there's been a lot of, okay, well, we're going to set up a second camera back here, or the paraprofessional's iPhone, and they're going to, and then you get into lots
Right.
of HIPAA. I mean, there's all kinds of
Right.
things wrapped up into, you know, it's just complicated, and it's not standardized, right? And as we know,
Right.
when giving evaluations, that's a very important piece to the validity of the results, is standardization. So the platform includes the ability that when the student clicks on something with the mouse, I, as a therapist, see exactly what they're clicking on, and I can see the order of things they click on, because we know that there's the portions of our tests that require first, second,
Specific.
last. What
Yeah.
order did you do it in? So again, it might seem like a small thing. It's one of the things that has me like jumping for joy that we, that we have that
That's
ability, that we
right.
can provide that to clinicians so that they can really seamlessly administer those remote evaluations.
I think for me as a teletherapist, I think that the thing that I'm most excited about is that everything is going to be in one place. I
Mm-hmm.
can do my service tracker there. I've
Mm-hmm.
got all of my dates there. I've got
Right.
this platform that I'm going to be able to provide services. And then the assessments. The assessments
Mm-hmm.
can sometimes be the most difficult part of our job,
Right.
like you said. So having
Mm-hmm.
everything there and
Mm-hmm.
streamlined and easy to
Yeah.
access, that's what
Yes.
I'm most excited about.
Yeah. And, being able to download the protocols. So, that is functionality that fortunately the publishers are providing within the platform. And so,
Wow.
and for us, that's a cost that we are taking care of. So
Right.
clinicians they're not paying for their protocols. They, can print them, and so they can get them whenever they need. So there's no waiting on, protocols to be overnighted or
Mailed or
ordered, and which I've, helped with in the past when there's those urgent, like, oh my gosh, I just got this student on my caseload and their testing is due in 2 days. That
right.
happens to us as SLPs a lot. Yeah, so there's just great features in there that, another really cool thing is that the clinician has the ability to do some customization in the therapy room, including adding like kind of closed captioning at the bottom
Oh, wow.
and in other languages. So, potentially if you have, a student who might be, dual language and maybe, in Spanish, for instance, and of course, if they read, that might help if, if you are, especially if you don't have an interpreter right there all the time. But I'm just thinking even more for parents, you can hold the IEP meeting within that room and have, the words translated across the bottom during an IEP meeting. So I think there's some really cool stuff like that therapists will really appreciate.
Yeah. I know that districts, and this is going to be one of my last questions, most districts have their own platform, whether, like you said, whether they use Teams or whether they use Zoom or another platform.
Right.
Have the school districts that work with AMN and that you've worked with, have they been open to their therapists using something different and using this Televate platform?
Yeah, so most are. I really push hard on the education piece and helping districts understand there is a significant difference between doing therapy for your students, for how they are engaging with services, if it is a business platform versus a platform that was designed for teletherapy. Where we see some pushback is mostly in large districts that work with several different contracting agencies. So they have teletherapists from that are working with different companies. And so they have made the decision in some cases that like all of the therapists, regardless of what company they're contracting with, are going to use the same platform. And I understand that. I do understand that from, a consistency standpoint for them, for kids. So, that's not ideal, but the most important thing is that kids are getting services. So that's number one. But yeah, it really is the best thing for kids. It is a better experience, and it allows the therapist to be just more efficient and to offer have those features that help them to better translate their skills working in person to the virtual environment.
Right. And just increase engagement. And that's, that can sometimes be challenging with younger kids, kids who may be on the severe profound, it's just, it's hard sometimes to get that engagement. So that's going to be great. So, well, Kristin, thank you so much for joining us today. I know I've learned a lot about teletherapy, and I hope that the speech pathologists out there that are listening, that you've learned something about teletherapy and that it's not scary. It's not brand new. It's something that's been around. There are people in the field like yourself and others who've been doing it for a really long time. And you don't have to have any special skills. And you don't have to have any special training to be a good teletherapist. I don't know a speech pathologist who is not 100% amazing. So thank you so much, Kristin, for joining us today. You have given us so much good information, and I really have enjoyed talking to you and learning about your background in teletherapy, and I will probably be reaching out to you for some tips and tricks. So
that would be great.
I hope you guys listening. You're welcome. I hope everyone listening enjoyed the podcast today. We look forward to hearing from you guys soon. If you have any questions about teletherapy, you can visit us at our website. And Kristin said that you're more than welcome to reach out to her. So thank y'all so much, and we'll see you soon. Bye. Thank you for tuning in to SLP Full Disclosure. You can learn more about this episode and our show on our website at amnhealthcare.com. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with a friend and subscribe to our show on your favorite podcast platform. You can also find show updates and SLP opportunities on our Instagram at AMN Allied. Special thanks to AMN Healthcare for making this show possible. See y'all next time.